Scriptorium is a technique that can take you to higher levels of proficiency, fluency, and mastery in your target language. I'm going to show you today with some ancient languages, but first, a modern language, though some old literature. Here we go, the beginning of Dante's Inferno. Now, this technique is where you take the longest phrase that you can commit to memory, short-term memory, just by reading it. For me, the first line, nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita. I can keep that in my short-term memory, and now I'm going to, without looking at the original text, nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita. Now, third step, did I make any spelling errors? I make sure, okay, looks like I spelled it right. I didn't say della nostra vita or di nostra vita, all that's okay. And if it is, then I reread, not the original, but my writing, nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita. And those are the 4 steps of my version of the Scriptorium technique. What is so great about it is you can use it with any piece of writing, and that includes subtitles. And that's where this video sponsor, Lingopie, comes in.
Lingopie gives you access to content in 10 different languages.
È iniziata un'altra bellissima giornata! E ho una fame da lupi, sì!
And my favorite part about it are these integrated subtitles. You can have the subtitles in the original language, in English, or both at the same time. And look at the right, you have the whole script to follow to go line by line.
Al ladro mi hanno appena rubato la colazione!
And in addition to its long integration with Netflix, Lingopie now has integration with Disney Plus. That's right. By installing the browser plugin, you'll be able to interact with Disney Plus and Netflix with all its incredibly easy-to-use features. As you know, I enjoy using dub programming, say an American show that's been dubbed into Italian, as a way to increase my proficiency in that language. But if you turn on the Italian subtitles, those are a translation of the original English, not the exact Italian dubbing you might be hearing. But with this, you get the text that you're hearing. That's right, a transcription of the dubbed audio.
L'età è tutto ciò che può darmi.
Sì, l'età è 50 anni. Possiamo fornirle anche l'ultima posizione segnalata.
Wait a minute. Werner Herzog in Italian? Pretty cool, but let's hear him in German.
Die Kopfgeldjagd ist ein kompliziertes Berufsfeld.
Yes, Werner Herzog agrees that this is a very useful way to learn a language. Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, Japanese, Korean, Chinese, Russian, Turkish, and Dutch. This is incredible.
Hayır, o itfaiye arabası.
Estoy fatigada. Yo he entendido, Esposo es tarde y en mi estado es mejor.
The subtitles also have an auto pause feature. This is incredibly useful, including to use the Scriptorium technique.
Ni un palo al agua.
Ni un palo al agua. I say that and then I try to write it down from memory. Or if you're not trying to use the Scriptorium technique with this, you can just repeat after every single phrase. It's an incredible way to acquire language in just the way you need, whether beginner, intermediate, or advanced. Sign up today at the link in the description.
So this Scriptorium technique is extremely effective. I'm going to tell you how I came upon it, and it was entirely by accident. The name of this, of course, Scriptorium, is from the famous Alexander Arguelles. And I'm going to tell you about his version of it in a second. I didn't have a name for it 20 years ago when I was learning Latin with Familia Romana. This is actually my copy, which is almost 20 years old. And what I did is I realized that in this terrific book were really good examples of, although very simple, well-written Latin prose. I felt it, even though I was just a beginner. I felt like, ooh, this is really good. So I realized that I need to just download this into my brain. How can I do that? And for whatever reason, I felt that transcribing it would be a really good idea. So what I did was not merely write it silently. In fact, if you transcribe things silently, I'm sure there is some benefit. But the whole essence of my version of this technique, at least, the out loud recitation is absolutely essential, not just writing it down silently. So I would read a phrase, sometimes it was just a couple words, that was all I could remember, and then I would write it down from memory, from that short-term memory. But what I would find is that in time, over days and weeks, the 3 months it took me to transcribe this entire book, my memory got better and better. So soon I could do long periods, long phrases in whole sentences, sometimes even whole paragraphs. I could recite it aloud and I could write it, maybe not error-free, but that's why there's the error correction part of this. Make sure that you have done it correctly. And it worked extremely well. What I had then done is, over the course of 3 months, effectively been speaking Latin, well-written, though simple, elementary Latin, for about 3 months. And that's why I had a very basic conversational fluency after that period. And I've done that also with other books, in Greek, for example, with Thrasymachus, and we're also going to see it later for a little bit of Old English. So let me show you another one. Let's go to some literature. Now, it can be for these basic introductory books, which is great, but why don't we see it with some wonderful literature. First, this is one of my favorite Christmas gifts from my fiancée, Irene, who gave me Miles Gloriosus, and in addition to being a wonderful and hilarious play by Plautus, and having, of course, this great Italian translation next to it, which is nice and fun, and those are really useful, those editions. It is a terrific example of colloquial Latin, although it is, yes, from the second century BC. So what I'm going to do is read this phrase aloud. I've never tried to memorize this before, which is actually different from the Dante. But I'm going to say this aloud. Curat ut splendor meo sit clupeo glarior. And in fact, I don't feel super confident saying it once. I'm going to say it again. Curat ut splendor meo sit clupeo glarior. I'm not going to look at it. I already forgot. What's the first word? Curate, right. Curate, long vowels. And I already didn't remember. Curat ut splendor, curat ut splendor, curat ut splendor. And I have to look again because it's not sticking yet, but I'll get used to it in time. Curat ut splendor meo sit clupeo glarior. And something too that you notice by reading these things out loud, this is of course meant to be acoustically hilarious because it has all these g's in it. Curat ut splendor meo sit clupeo glarior. Now, third step, did I make any spelling errors? Looks all good. In fact, I've improved it by adding the macron, something we all need to do in Latin and ancient Greek. Curat ut splendor meo sit clupeo glarior. And now I have started to download, if you will, a little bit of actual Latin literature into my brain. This could be a way to get to memorizing a text if you want to memorize it, or it could more simply be just a way to get used to the patterns of, in this case, Plautus, or of the way that comedy, in this case, is written. This is, of course, very good conversational examples. Yes, it's a little older than classical Latin, but it's still a good basis for how the ancient Romans really spoke. All right, let's go to the mother language, and that, of course, is Greek. Here's Plato's Apology. Let us go right to the very beginning. And now, here it is. There we go. He's poor Socrates trying to defend his very life, not doing a great job of it, but doing some excellent philosophy. Hoti men humes, o andres athenaioi. So let's see how much I could remember. Hoti men I'm going to change my font here. Humes. O Andres athenaioi. Pepontate eupotonemon kategoron o koida. Let's see how much I remember. Pontate eupotonemon kategoron uk oida. Now I'm cheating a little bit because I know the beginning of this really well. In fact, I memorized at least that first line. But this is how I do it in particular, and something that differs from how the wonderful polyglot Alexander Arguelles does it is actually right here. I'm not trying to write this very neatly or very carefully or very beautifully. One can, and he emphasizes that in his version. We're going to talk about his version a little bit later. But the main thing I'm doing is step number 1, reciting aloud the longest phrase I think I can do. Maybe it's just hoti. Maybe it's the first 2 words. Maybe that's all you can do. Now, depending what your level is of either speaking or reading whether a modern language or ancient language or exposure to literature or anything, you may only get 2 words. Even if you're an advanced reader in ancient Greek, you might be just so used to constantly looking at the words on the page and not getting an auditory version of them. And whatever pronunciation you like, of course. I'm using classical Attic pronunciation. This is classical Attic literature, so that works pretty well. But you can do whatever pronunciation you like. The point is that you need to hear it. It's your voice, and you're turning it into a multiple language learning discipline experience. This is why I think it works so well. You have all 4 of the traditional language learning disciplines at play. Reading, writing, listening, and speaking. I'm reading. And then I am, of course, reciting aloud. So I'm speaking, and then I'm hearing myself. Then, of course, there's the memory exercise part of it, which is very useful, even though it's just short-term memory. Very, very effective. So, hoti men hu mes. I hear that, and I hear myself doing it. We don't get to have auditory input from other people, right? Who don't, because there are no native speakers. We are the only ones who can bring these ancient languages alive, Latin, Greek, Old English, which we're going to see a little bit later. We're the only ones that can do it in our own voice, and having that auditory input is essential. Now, how much of this should you do? Really, as much as you can. If you are learning, for example, using a more elementary textbook or using a reader of some kind, then it might behoove you to write a lot of it, as much as you can possibly handle, but not necessarily. Sometimes just a few phrases, just being able to have the very beginning of Plato's Apology, if you're a Hellenist like myself, is going to be extremely useful to have. Now, let us look at something I wanted actually to write, because it's really great literature, like Plato's Apology, or here, Isocrates. He had this line at the beginning of the Panegyricus. I've never said that in English before. I really liked. But since oratory is of such a nature that it is possible to discourse on the same subject matter in many different ways, to present the great as lowly, or invest the little with grandeur, and so forth. And all of that is fantastic. In fact, I liked it so much, I even just wrote it down today in this is my commonplace notebook. You've seen it before in other videos. That is definitely more in line with how Alexander Arguelles likes to do his technique. I mean, he named Scriptorium. I do something, I had been doing something 20 years ago and still do, that is similar enough that I think it merits using the title. This is essentially a Scriptorium, so we'll call it my version of the Scriptorium technique. So, here is the Greek, and the Greek, of course, is way better than the English. Epide doi logoi doiauten ekusi tem pusin. So, epide, doi logoi, and this is from memory. Epide doi logoi, as far as I have. Epide doi logoi doiauten ekusi tem pusin. Doi auten ekusi tem. I'm doing this phonetically because it starts with a labial next. Tem pusin, tem pusin. This is just something I like to do. This is what Attic inscriptions do. Tem pusin. So discourses, words, speeches, oratory has such a nature. Tem pusin. And then the next, host hoion denai, that they are able. Host hoion denai, periton auton polakos, ex hergesastai. Let's see how much I remember. Host hoion denai, hoion denai, periton auton, Periton auton polakos ex he, note the internal rough breathing, ex he gesas tai. Now, Isocrates is an orator, and he's possibly one of the best. Demosthenes, of course, is really good too. And what's so great about the prose, that is not just in ancient Greek, but also in Latin. This goes all the way up until the 2nd century AD, including Plutarch. I also have Plutarch here. He does the exact same thing, and that are these clausulae. Doesn't really pertain to the video, but it is something that if you write it out by hand, you can now do. You can now see the lengths at the ends of the phrases. Periton auton. Let's see. So, for example, just this one. Exhegesastai. So, this one. So, po la kos exhegesastai. Wow. Look at all those long syllables at the end of the line. You think he did that by accident? Nope. He knows what he's doing. Polakos exegesastai. And that is something that's, of course, fun about writing it by hand for sure. But you don't only have to write these things by hand, you can also type them. And this is where I differ a lot with Alexander Arguelles as far as the whole idea and the goal. His goal is to do something where you have even a nice book, you might even have a really pretty cover, like this is my edition of Inferno, that, instead of just, some graph paper that I'm using, which is the exact opposite of the kind of nice, sort of really careful writing that he would want to put into his version when he does Scriptorium and how he recommends it in his technique. And this is not to say that his way of doing it is worse or it could be better than mine, just because he is, of course, such an accomplished linguist. But I have a different goal. His goal primarily is to make extremely lovely pieces of your own handwriting that of your target language or multiple languages that you're trying to learn and to master. My goal is more, frankly, it's oral proficiency. It's speaking ability as well as reading ability, focusing especially like with Latin and ancient Greek, how to get this language into your brain. Now with all the longs and the shorts, the rhythm of the language that is contained in those long and short syllables, like in Latin and ancient Greek and Old English, among others, being able to speak it and feel it really adds to your appreciation of what the ancient authors are doing. And even if you're not doing that in your own pronunciation, you are still acquiring the syntax, the discourse sequence of, this comes before this, and you start to internalize it. We don't need to be fluent speakers of these languages, but we want to make them our own in a way that's comparable to how we would learn, for example, great Italian literature. Even if, say I wanted to be a medievalist and study Italian literature, but I had no interest in speaking the language fluently, but I'd still want to be able to read this with a level of fluency comparable to those who are able to speak conversationally in the language. Well, it takes hearing this language aloud, especially this target language, because Dante's language is certainly a little bit different than modern Italian. Figliuol mio, look at that, isn't that pretty? Figliuol mio, Toscano vecchio, it's wonderful. And speaking of old languages, especially medieval languages, let us use some of Colin Gorey's brand new Ōsweald Bera, Ōsweald the Bear. And how could you use this? Well, you could start right at the beginning, right at page 1. You could do this with any introductory textbook, any book that you might want to learn with. And you start right with the title, Ōsweald Bera. Ōsweald Bera. Mildruth and hira fader. I'm already not sure the spelling, so I'm looking up constantly, which I'm going to say it's okay for the brand new learner. I'm not a raw beginner. I guess I'm upper level beginner. I'm not quite intermediate. Mildruth and hira fader. Okay. Double check the spelling. Mildruth and hira fader. All right. Looks okay. That's the title of that. On Englelande is Lyteltun. On Englelande is Lyteltun. On Englelande is Lyteltun. I don't want to look at it. On Englelande is Lyteltun. Let's see, did I spell it right? On Englelande is Lyteltun. Looks fine. Looks like I got the long vowels. That's good. Let's try another. And on tham tune is Lytelhus. And on tham tune is Lytelhus. And on tham... Oh, I think is that long? I think it's long. Hold on. Tune is Lytelhus. And tham is long. Okay. So I double check that. I got that wrong, but that's why we check. And I read aloud, and on tham tune is little hus. Those are the 4 steps. The first one, you choose the phrase, the longest phrase that you think you can remember. The second is to not let your pen die, because that's embarrassing. So the first step is to choose a phrase that you're able to remember. You saw that in some cases I wasn't able to remember a whole phrase, and I got some mistakes, and you kind of look back and forth, but eventually get in the flow of it. I'm also trying to not belabor this as far as doing it in the kind of slow precision I might be doing if I were doing this on my own, because I really want to get the message across of what I think are these 4 essential steps. And notice how many times there is recitation, speaking, and hearing. I choose a phrase. Let's choose the next one. Heo, and on tham huse is little maiden. And I said it once. Do I think I have it from memory? Not quite sure. Let me say it again. And on tham huse is little maiden. And my pen died, but it doesn't matter. The point is, don't let your pen die. Very important not to do that. I don't know why I'm closing it, because it's clearly dead. But anyway, this is the pen that decided to die on me. This is going in the original. We're keeping this. I'm not cutting this out. So the point is, you try to remember that phrase, as long of a phrase as you possibly can, to the point where you might even be able to do whole phrases or paragraphs. How many of you out there might know the beginning of Roma in Italias, Italia in Europas, and all those other sentences from the beginning of Familia Romana? And if I were to read this several times, just going through it, just trying to master spelling this right, transcribing it accurately, is a way to really internalize the language, because you will have said it multiple times. Even the minimum number of times of speaking is at least twice, right? So I choose a phrase, on Englodande is little pun, and then I make sure I have it. I might say it aloud again. So once I said it. Now again, on Englodande is little pun. It's in my short-term memory. I write it. As I write it, I recite it aloud. On Englodande is little pun is how I would then write it. So another time, I double check for any spelling errors, and then I read my writing, on Englodande is little tun. So saying it 3 or 4 times, at least. That is why this works so well. This is how you can take languages, whether at an absolute beginner level or to rather advanced literature, and really acquire the language.
So what is Alexander Arguelles' version of Scriptorium? He named it. Why did he name it that way? Because the medieval monks, they would transcribe all those classic books, including probably the ones that we were seeing just today. It's thanks to them and other people who were transcribing these things, often aloud, that we actually have these works today, which is amazing. And they probably learned the languages pretty well in the process. So his technique, as we see here, this is his video. After you see this video, go see the Scriptorium step by step, because he gives his version. He originated this. My version, I originated on my own, like I said, exactly 20 years ago this summer. And in any case, the steps he has here: read a sentence or a portion of a sentence aloud. Say each word aloud again as you write it. This is pretty much the same as mine. Read the sentence aloud as you have written it, so you read your own version of it, and check for errors, which is also in mine, and also points that need clarification or as needed. So what is he saying there? If you don't understand something, it's like, why is there, like if it's the Greek, why, there's a smooth breathing here or a rough breathing or something, or an accent I wasn't expecting. You take notes of things mentally. It's like, that's interesting. What it really does is it brings your focus onto the language in a terrific way that reading alone doesn't bring. Reading, even intense reading, can get you close, but when you have to write every single letter, you get much closer to the detail, certainly of the writing, and can therefore appreciate and understand the written language in future readings much better. Or if there's a word you don't understand, look it up in the dictionary if you want to do that right now, or do it later. But the point is that you're really focusing on everything, and which is fantastic. He recommends doing this regularly at maybe the same time of day, every day, some kind of regular interval, so that you get really good, especially at the language that you really want to focus on, if not multiple languages for the polyglots, because he also provides this advice not just to people learning a specific language, but to people wanting to maintain their proficiency in many languages as polyglots, and also polyliteracy. And you want to do this for a certain period, as long as you can actually maintain focus on it. And that may not be very long, especially the way that, as we'll see, Alexander Arguelles recommends doing it, which is yet more intense when it comes to the final product. When you've completed your session for the day, reread everything you have written down, that is, reread your own handwriting. And then when you begin the next session, which should be the next day, there should be an everyday activity, according to Alexander Arguelles, then read what you wrote the previous day before continuing where you left off. And Alexander Arguelles emphasizes high attention to detail, which I do as well. It's not just copying, as he says. If you were just copying, you probably wouldn't be saying anything aloud. To me, the saying aloud part is the most important part of this activity. And in his version of Scriptorium, the idea is, in fact, to slow down, to put a lot of precision also in how your handwriting looks. This results in a nice looking product, and the point of it, according to Alexander Arguelles, is to really bring that attention to the formal grammar, the syntax, and the vocabulary. He says that this is not an activity for those who just want to speak, and I think if you are interested in learning to speak a modern language, that's absolutely true. Using other techniques of his, like shadowing. See the video where I've talked about shadowing, the method that Alexander Arguelles is perhaps most famous for. That can be a really effective way just to gain speaking ability. But when it comes to ancient languages, most of our input and even perhaps our output is reading and then reciting aloud the books that we read. So when it comes to Latin, Old English, Ancient Greek, Coptic, using Scriptorium is probably one of the best ways to actually get speaking proficiency. According to Alexander Arguelles, writing by hand is crucial. Why does he feel that way? Well, he feels that way as many other people do when it comes to taking notes or other exercises of memory, that it produces a better effect. I don't know if that's actually true. I transcribed Familia Romana entirely by typing. In fact, I convinced myself that, well, actually, I'm using, both sides of my brain because I'm using two hands. Maybe this is actually better for my memory. And that may be the case, or I may be wrong about that. I actually don't know. I do know that the way I did it worked very well for me, and I know that I can type faster in Ancient Greek and in Latin than I can write by hand. Arguelles emphasizes that you don't want to do this too swiftly. You want to take your time. You want to really put a lot of effort into form. I admire this a lot. He talks about this with shadowing, like you should be walking and do it with good posture, these incorporating a bit of exercise. These are ancillary things potentially to language learning, but he has found them for himself, as have many of his students over the years, extremely effective, and I don't think he's wrong about that. I think that is all correct. He speaks of the musician who, you could play, the clarinet or whatever, the piano with bad form physically, but if you have the good form, good posture and all those things, it makes a person a better singer. That's certainly true for when you're singing because you need the air. You are the instrument physically if you're a singer. And also if you're performing with an instrument, having good posture can lead to better results potentially as well. That's what all the masters seem to say, right? And so he includes that in his techniques too. Form, posture, and I admire that greatly. I don't think it's wrong. However, when it came to transcribing Familia Romana, I did want to do it as swiftly as possible. I wanted the maximum attention to detail, but to get through it as quickly as I can. That for me was typing, including all the long vowels, all the macrons. I did it all by hand, typing, with the very, that orange one you saw a little while ago, that 20-year-old book 20 years ago. Summer of 2005, that's what I was doing. Even the Bansa, I transcribed all of those as well, also by typing. I did a little by hand, but I think I did almost all of the Bansa by typing, if I recall correctly. Rewriting every single word, not just filling in the blanks. So when you start to use Scriptorium, you'll have to consider which is going to be better for you. Again, since typing is faster for me, it seems to work better. I get the same amount of attention to detail, I feel, as I do by writing by hand, but I do it faster because if I want to get through, let's say, an entire beginner textbook, I've been transcribing Ōsweald Bera, for example. If I do it by hand, I had to actually try it too because I wanted to do it the Alexander Arguelles way. Boy, it takes so long. But I know if I successfully transcribe all of that book, my comprehension of Old English will be through the roof. It'll be as good as it was for Latin at the end of summer 2005 when I had already transcribed all the Familia Romana. I'm sure it'll be that good, whether I do it by hand or typing it. But do I want to spend a year or 2 years transcribing it by hand, or do I want to spend, 3-4 months typing it on a computer? As long as I'm doing all those repetitions of speaking and really trying to stretch my short-term memory to get long sentences, maybe multiple sentences, as much as I possibly can, and transcribe that, I know what that will do is it will just bring the language into my mind, into my psyche, into my long-term memory either way. At least that is my opinion on the matter. Definitely experiment with both. Given that Alexander Arguelles named his technique Scriptorium, I had my own thing, and actually I think that's how I discovered Alexander Arguelles. I talked about it in some video. This is how I learned Latin. I transcribed La Familia Romana, blah, blah, blah. And I was insane. I was 20 years old. That's how it goes. And then someone said, hey, did you get this idea from Alexander Arguelles? And I was like, oh, no, who's that? And that's how I found out about the Alexander Arguelles Scriptorium technique and his wonderful YouTube channel. In a different video, Alexander Arguelles shows how he illustrates and doing it in color, getting one of those nice unlined, bound books, maybe leather bound, something like that, and writing, really pretty handwriting. If you have an alphabet that goes from right to left, like Semitic alphabets or something, then you could start at the the back of the book from the right side of the book and go that way. And from the left side, you do your left to right languages like Latin or ancient Greek and so forth. Anyway, there are different ways that you could do it, and he emphasizes that then after you put in all that effort, making your handwriting really nice as well. You have this beautiful product that can make you feel really proud of what you've accomplished in doing that. And I think there's a lot of value in that too. That's why I have where did I put it? My commonplace notebook, where in addition to, taking notes, or this is my ephemeris technique, where I just write the stuff I've been doing and, stuff like that. But I have pictures as well. And I also, of course, working on handwriting, I also, I try to use my uncials, practicing writing in uncials or different kinds of Greek font handwriting and things like that. And picture, so there is a lot of value in that, of having something that can be kind of pretty to look at later, to review and to enjoy after having executed the activity itself, and that there is an ancillary benefit to that and can encourage you to want to learn more of the language, to learn more of the literature. That is his opinion about it, and I think he's right about it. But I also know from my own experience how well it works typing or writing on any piece of paper, even by hand, and not being super concerned about the beauty of the handwriting, making sure it's all accurate. All of the diacritical marks, all the long vowels, punctuation, all that is right, all the spelling, but trying to do it as quickly as possible while getting all the spoken repetitions. Now let me demonstrate that. All right, so here we have the wonderful and famous, the Latin Library. Now at the Latin Library, we can choose many things, but why not choose something really famous by Cicero, the beginning of his oration against Catiline, in Catilinam. So, first phrase, quousque tandabut Catilina patientia nostra. Quousque tande abut Catilina patientia nostra. All right, and I checked to see if there are any errors. Quousque tandabut. All right, looks fine. I've added the macrons, which improves it, of course. Quousque tandabut Catilina patientia nostra. Feel those clausulae. Feel that prose rhythm. Quandiu etiam furoriste tuus nos eludet. Quandiu etiam furoriste tuus nos eludet. Quandiu etiam furor iste. What is it? I forgot. Okay. Tuus furoriste tuus nos eludet. Tuus nos eludet. Que ad finem sese. Que ad finem sese. Effrenata iactabit audacia. Effrenata iactabit audacia. So if that were my writing session for the day, I'd say it again, all of it. Reading my writing. Quousque tandabut Catilina patientia nostra, quandiu etiam furoriste tuus nos eludet. Quad fine ses effrenata iactabit audacia. Boy, do I love all that prose rhythm. That is incredible. Now, that is just a little bit of Cicero, but we could choose someone else. We could choose Catullus, for example. This one's my favorite 51. Ad lesbiam. Ille mi paresse Deo videtur. Ille mi paresse Deo videtur. Ille si face superare divos. Ille si fas est superare divos. Qui sedens ad versus identi dente. Let me do that again. Qui sedens ad versus identi dente. Qui sedens ad versus identi dente. Spectate audit. And the meter, especially that sapphic meter, that is a little bit easier to remember line by line. Ille mi paresse Deo videtur. Ille si face superare divos. Qui sedens ad versus identi dente. Spectate audit. Ah, Catullus is amazing. Well, what about Greek? If you're trying to do some real literature, you can go to Persius. It has a lot of Latin too on Persius as well, but the Greek is all here. This is the beginning of Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War. So here's the beginning. Thucydides, Athenaios, Xunegrapse. Let me just do that much. Thucydides, Athenaios, Xunegrapse. Ton polemon ton Peloponnesion, ton polemon. This is deliberate because I want to remember the pronunciation well. Ton polemon ton Peloponnesion, Gaetenaion. Hos epolemesam prosallelus, hos epolemesam prosallelus, arxamenos eutus, and so forth. You may also find this useful for a beginner book. This is the ancient Greek reader that I've been working on. I took the original Thrasymachus book and I changed it pretty much completely. In particular, I've turned it into, well, I have this proem, these pre-chapters, but I've rendered each chapter, filling it in with novel-like details. Wait, there's my picture. Hey, it came back. This is what I use with my students, also what I'm using with the wonderful Bernox Chris Davis, as we have resumed the ancient Greek through Latin videos on Scorpio Martianus. And you can do the exact same thing with this as I was just doing now with the real ancient literature, which is simply to transcribe it in the Scriptorium way. And you can do it by typing, you can do it by hand, you can do it the full Arguelles way, or you can do it the Ranieri way, for lack of a better term. Hode Thrasymachus upo blepe ton theon. Ho de Thrasymachus upo blepe ton theon. Hoigar optalmoi etiklestoesi. Hoigar optalmoi etiklestoesin. Since there's a good amount of dialogue here, that can be useful to gain some spoken proficiency too, right? So hod hermes epilambanetai. Start with that. Hod hermes epilambanetai. Me lege o karon. Me lege o karon. Alla toi ploioi pere. Alla toi ploioi pere. Hemas is haidu. Hemas is haidu. Hod hermes epilambanetai. Me legio karon. Alla toi ploioi pere hemas is haidu. And so forth and so on. I think this is just a terrific way to acquire language. There's the Alexander Arguelles version. He named Scriptorium, so maybe for me to present my alternative, maybe we should call it something else and not Scriptorium, but although I came upon it independently, since Arguelles is the indisputed master of polyglottery and certainly of using this technique, I thought it was only fair to show you his method, how he likes to do it, as well as what I find is most useful for me.
I hope I've excited you today about the fact that this is a very powerful technique that can help you acquire not just beginner literature, but advanced literature, and not just about the literature, but when it comes to ancient languages like Latin, ancient Greek, Old English, the only way to really acquire them well is through reading the original text. So try the Scriptorium technique, whether my version or Alexander Arguelles' version. I think it's incredibly helpful, and please leave a comment, whether today or in the next few days or weeks, if you find it helpful, or if you found any challenges with it. I want to hear from you. So, gratias vobis ago, karin humin echo. Thank you so much, and thanks especially to my Patreon supporters, and thanks again to LinguaPi for sponsoring the video. Valente.